when you think about the one document that speaks to how Americans think about themselves, it's not the Constitution. The Constitution is the laws. The document that really defines who we are is the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence, this idea, again in the blue section, self-evident truths that all people are created equal. At that point, it was all white men, all property-owning white men. This did not include women. This certainly did not include Native Americans. It did not include enslaved peoples. It only included white property-owning men. So it's interesting. It's sort of like saying only about a quarter of the population is created equal, and they have rights. But the idea that all men are created equal, African Americans read and understood this too, and they understood this meant them. Women understood this meant them. And so it's going to have a powerful influence going forward. Martin Luther King is going to reference this document. The women's rights movement is going to reference this document. All peoples fighting for rights tend to reference this document or some version of it. If you look at where government power comes from in the red part, governments are based on the power of the people, right? That's where the sovereignty, that's your 10-cent word, social studies word of the day. Sovereignty just means power, right? Their power comes from the people and the consent of those people to allow the government to have its position. And then in the purple part, if we don't like what that government is doing, we have a right to rebel against it, which made a lot more sense back then when you actually could rebel against the government because it wasn't all that powerful. But the important point is this was the central core way in which Americans thought of who we were. And the interesting thing about this is the primary author of this declaration was Thomas Jefferson. And when I say he's the American philosopher, he gets that reputation based almost single-handedly on this document, even though a lot of those ideas weren't originally his. We'll get more into that in class. Thomas Jefferson was hardly an everyday person. He lived on a giant plantation. He had almost 150 slaves, including one that he was living with and had children by. We'll get to that in a minute. But the point is he viewed himself in this weird way as just being kind of an everyday guy working in his garden. If you look at his garden on the right, that's not a garden that one person can work. That's a garden that 50 to 75 enslaved peoples worked every day. So that's the irony behind the Declaration, including the fact, by the way, that when he was writing it, he had a slave holding a candle over his shoulder. His slave Jupiter was literally illuminating the manuscript as he wrote it. So clearly this is a guy that when he talks about all men is only thinking about it in a certain way and very limited way. So the Declaration of Independence is going to be celebrated as we go forward in time as this sort of great moment where everyone got together to sign, and this is complete propaganda. In fact, the Declaration of Independence was signed over the course of 4 or 5 days. People kind of trickled in and signed it. There was no great moment like this, but this becomes part of the mythology of the American nation. We also build huge monuments to Jefferson, based on this Roman model, this huge temple to the god Jefferson. Here he is in all his glory, this great man with these brilliant ideas. We don't mention the fact that, in fact, the Declaration was actually written by 5 people. Jefferson was only the writer of the first draft, but all these other men also contributed to it. And it's interesting that most Americans don't know this. We always want to emphasize the individual accomplishment and not the group one. And I think it says something about our culture that we think about individuals before groups of people. The other thing to know about Jefferson is that he not only did he own slaves and did he enslave people himself, he also had a relationship by one, Sally Hemings, who was actually related to his wife, weirdly, because she was raped. His wife's father had also raped Sally Hemings' grandmother. And Jefferson was, again, when I say involved in a relationship, she was 15 years old when he started this, and he was 30 years older than she was, right? So this was not a consensual relationship. This was a white man forcing his slave to live as his wife and to have children by him. And this really calls us into question what we think of this guy, Jefferson. If you look at the descendants of Jefferson, if you look carefully at this picture, you'll see there are white people, and there are also some black people in here, right? The descendants of Sally Hemings. So you have the Jeffersons all coming together as a family now, which is interesting at this point in time. So if you look at Jefferson's idea, they have a bit of a troubled legacy. When Timothy McVeigh here bombed the Oklahoma City building, which was a government building, he did it because he felt the government was being oppressive. And on the shirt that he wears, there it is on the right, he basically says the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants, which means, you need to attack tyrants. And Jefferson thought that was a good idea. And Timothy McVeigh was thoroughly convinced that Jefferson would have agreed with him. And he may weirdly have been right about that. Jefferson was very much all about liberty and against oppression. Black Lives Matter activists also in some ways are Jeffersonian, right? We'll talk more about why you might think about that. What is the thing that they are protesting? And why would Jefferson perhaps agree, weirdly enough? Not that he could see this in his lifetime, but if you think about his philosophy, perhaps he would be, at least in principle, understanding of them, as he would have be for anti-maskers, right? People who don't want the government telling them what to do. So if you look at the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights is the part of the Constitution which focuses on the rights for individuals, so it's an extension of the Declaration. These things are enshrined in a great big archive in Washington, D.C. And if you think about why is it that we worship these documents, what's so important about them, even for people who are not originally included in the idea of freedom and equality, I want you to think about what about these values makes them so important, because that's the core idea of this particular class.